All right, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to the longest running show in the world about data. It's called DM Radio. Yours truly, Eric Kavanaugh, is here with a very smart person who is just coming out of stealth. We're going to be talking to Oz Wasserman, co-founder of a company called Opsin Security. That's OPSIN Security. And guess what? We're going to talk about generative AI. That's right, large language models. We're going to talk about RAG models. We're going to talk about one of the most pressing issues right now for companies looking to leverage these large language models, which is governance and security. How do you make sure that only appropriate data is shared with large language models from an IP perspective, from a privacy perspective, from an audit trail perspective, from a regulatory perspective? How do you do that? It's not terribly easy. Data governance comes into play, but these folks have done some interesting things in the architecture to be able to allow you to know that only the appropriate and trusted data is used for AI. And folks, that's called responsible AI. So with that, Oz Wasserman, welcome to DM Radio. Tell us a bit about yourself and maybe where the idea came from and what you're working on right now.
Awesome. So first of all, thank you for having me, Eric, and great fan of the show. So thanks for hosting.
Yeah.
A little bit about myself, and then definitely about Opsin as a company. But I am a security engineer by training, early career in security engineering, and then a lot of work on the product management and engineering side when it came to mostly security vendors. So I have experience from companies like FireEye, Abnormal Security, and a bunch of startups specifically in the data security and governance space. And again, my background's mostly in product around data security, email security, data governance outside of the world of generative AI. And it's funny you mentioned because how the idea came about. I used to work at Abnormal Security back then and had a great counterpart. His name was James, and he's also my co-founder. He was responsible for the AI and ML platform teams there. So we got reconnected right after I was at an amazing generative AI conference, and I was just blown away by how this technology really enabled a lot of these industries that were kind of blocked from doing a lot of the innovation. Literally with GPT-4, they were talking about how many things are just now enabled from the very get-go to be done and transform entire industries. I remember I was talking to my wife and I was just stunned. I couldn't really sleep. And I was like, I want to be part of this. This is as big as the internet revolution in the early 2000s. So I was like, how can I combine, my expertise around security, governance, with the world of generative AI from more of an enablement perspective? How can I actually enable these industries to push forward with innovation? So I reconnected with James. We were working with each other for about 8 months, 9 months now, doing a lot of discovering challenges of problems of these teams that are trying to innovate with generative AI. And here we are, um, running forward, deploying with our customers and having a great time.
Yeah, and this is such an exciting space, I think, because there are so many forces at play, because this technology is relatively new and really remarkably powerful. I think that's what really has taken people aback and gotten people so excited and concerned, quite frankly, is that when you start using a large language model for the first time, you almost can't believe what you're seeing. You're like, how is this even possible? And it's kind of amazing what goes into it under the hood, like from folks like OpenAI or Claude with Anthropic, Google with Gemini, and that's the one I typically use. But you realize quickly this is incredibly powerful stuff. It's great for generating text that is syntactically perfect and usually very accurate. But the large language models are just that. They are large, and as so, they are remarkably unwieldy. And if you want to use this technology in the enterprise, well, you want to use some of your own corporate data, typically as part of what's called a RAG model. We've talked a lot about RAG models on this show, retrieval augmented generation. It's basically a trick they came up with at Meta, because they realized that without some moorings, without some guardrails baked into the workflow, you could just get all kind of crazy text coming out of these systems, and that's no good for the enterprise. I mean, it could be good for a creative writer, for example. It's good for certain use cases, but if you have to be concerned about regulations, if you're in financial services or healthcare or any number of those industries, or even just protecting your intellectual property, then you have to be careful about that. So a lot of that mooring, if you will, or that balancing, that deployment of guardrails comes in these RAG models, these retrieval augmented generative models. Can you, for the layperson out there listening to the radio, can you explain how a RAG model works in layman's terms?
Yeah, absolutely, and I definitely agree. I mean, with this innovation that Meta came with, it just brings the barrier down when it comes to just getting started with generative AI in a meaningful way, right? Because at the end of the day, from a high level perspective, you really want the generative AI application you're building internally to be meaningful for your organization, to have a business
Right.
value attached to it, which truly means that it needs to be grounded into the context of the organization. And that's how this whole idea of RAG models, and it's if you do it in a very simplistic way, um, traditionally what people have done with the world of machine learning and artificial intelligence even before generative AI will be to train models to make it more contextual to your use case, to bring results that are meaningful for your business or for, the purpose that you started this whole infrastructure of machine learning or artificial intelligence. But that's, somewhat of a costly with truly the meaning of the word of it. It takes a long time and long effort to train a model to bring the data in, whether you decide to do fine tuning or whether you decide to do some other techniques. And then, the main problem is how do you get to value fast, and how do you obviously do it in a way that is accurate enough to just bring meaningful results. So RAG really allows you to connect data very easily to the model, and it's being done by using the traditional foundational models when talk to OpenAI or Anthropic or any other of these providers that develop these generative AI models that are trained on the entire internet. And that is connected alongside the organizational data, whether it comes from documents or whether it comes from structured data sources or content relational management systems, basically for the whole purpose of completing the context that these foundational models that are trained on the entire internet don't have on your company. So
Right.
basically, if I, ask a question about my own my own human resources information, if it's a human resources bot, I won't know my Oz's information unless I have the model connected to it in some shape or form. So the RAG model, as you mentioned, allows us to use the power of generative AI foundational model providers such as GPT-4 or GPT-4o with our own company data in a way that is easy to use, is easy to plumb.
Yeah, and you bring up a couple of really good points here. One, and just to help the audience understand, if you've used a large language model, you understand. You give it a prompt, you hit the enter key, and then it parses your prompt. It tries to figure out what you're asking it to do, and then it goes and it does that. And what you're doing at Opsin Security is baking in some security and governance geared around roles like LDAP or Active Directory, for example, different technologies already in place that have metadata about someone's authority level. Is it a manager? Is it a director? Is it a vice president? Is it someone in HR, for example, who should have added visibility into personal records of employees? So the point is that there are all of these different security profiles that you're pulling from some enterprise system, like I said, LDAP, Active Directory, however you manage your personnel. and their roles, and you're leveraging that in the runtime to determine which bits of data can be used to generate an answer via a prompt from a large language model, right?
That's correct. So just for the audience to level set. So when we are connecting generative AI models to data, as you mentioned in the beginning, Eric, generative AI is actually a new technology, a new stack. It means that even when companies are working on their data security and data governance programs and classify data before they even connect it to the generative AI model, what happens to the data when you connect it to the generative AI model, that we need to talk to it in what we call vector embeddings. So there is a
Right.
transformation that is happening from the data into the vector embedding, that if we don't embed those permissions in the model, the generative AI model, anybody that has access to the generative AI model can query and get all the information connected to it, whether they do have permission or not. So the mission that we are focused on in Opsin is to allow the organizations to connect their data securely into the generative AI model. What it truly means is, like you mentioned, it relies on two main things. One is the authentication of the person, who that person is, what's their role, what's their organizational responsibilities, and what they should have access to interact with. So, for example, if we're building an HR chatbot for the HR team and not the entire organization, then I know that an HR person likely is the person who needs to interact with the bot.
Right.
So that's the first level. And the second level is to obviously understand, once they do have the access to the model, whether they have permissioning on the data. So when they create a prompt or query, what is the employee benefit policy at company X? They do need to have access to that specific document or SQL query. Anything that is related to their role outside the model needs to be respected in the generative AI model. So that's what we're doing. We're orchestrating the secured connection of data to the model.
Yeah, and you actually reminded me of an excellent use case for these large language models. And you have to remember, what's so cool about them is they allow you to speak to your data, to speak to systems, but really documentation in systems like a human being would interact. So as opposed to a SQL query, SQL, the structured query language, which is how you talk to a database, or at least it's how different applications talk to a database. Here, you're just using natural language to ask a question of data. And where one very excellent use case is around policies. So HR policies can be voluminous. If it's a big company, you could have a 50, 60 page, 70-page document that goes into tremendous detail about HR policy, how to treat this situation, how to treat that situation. Well, expecting any employee to sit there and read the whole thing is expecting too much. Okay. I'm sorry. I would venture to say less than 1% of employees ever sit down and read the whole employee manual cover to cover. It's just not going to happen. So, what have we done historically? You would have a glossary in the back, and it would be like, okay, what did we do for paid time off? Okay, let's see what that's all about. And you could spend, I mean, an hour just poring over this big long document trying to find the part that you need, and then sometimes trying to understand what it even says. I mean, some of these policies are pretty arcane and not very well articulated. Well, enter large language models. Now, if you load that 50, 60-page policy document into your model, and then you can ask any questions about it, that's when you can get natural language responses to complex data and gets your answer just like that. So instead, again, of spending an hour or two of the employee time, of some HR person's time, just trying to get to the bottom of one particular rule, you just load it into the model and ask the darn questions, right?
That is correct. And in fact, it's funny you mentioning, we're actually working with a client in the food delivery space that does exactly that. They do an HR model for their internal employees, not only the HR department, but also for their employees, for exactly these reasons, to make the organization much more productive. And like you mentioned, reading a 60-page document can take sometimes hours, right? And then with a couple of prompts, you might be able to actually get the information that you needed without that. So I think the productivity gain for a lot of these use cases is actually very real. When we see
Yeah.
it, when we deploy our security layer, we obviously are tied into the business value of the application. And it's just phenomenal what organizations are able to achieve with these chatbots and these AI assistants. And again, it's truly empowering us to keep pushing with securing these applications.
Well, and so you just think about the layers of value. Let's just focus on this use case. We got about 2 minutes left in this opening segment. The layers of value that you get. Number one, you get to the nut faster and you get the answer more quickly. And in the early models, you did not have citation, but in some of these later models and in some of these sophisticated RAG models, or just to use a particular example, Click has a new technology called Click Answers. It's from a company called Kyndi, Kyndi. Ryan Welsh was on my show a couple of weeks ago. They were one of the first that I saw to really bake in this citation component where you're able to see where the model found the data that it's using in its answer to you. So it doesn't just give you an answer, that was the early phase, but it gives you the answer and then shows you where it got that information. That's tremendous. Now the HR person can double check. Okay, this is when it said it here, here. You could find out, oh, actually, you know what? It got this wrong because really it's supposed to include, I mean, there could be some errors, is my point, but still, it goes much faster. Well, so A, you get to the nut. B, you've helped morale because if someone knows they're going to have to go and pour over this book, like, oh gosh, do I really have to do this? There's going to be this opportunity cost of just not even bothering, right? I mean, that's what happens a lot of times if rules get too stringent, if they're too opaque, if they're too complex. What happens? People A, ignore them, B, intentionally go around them sometimes, or B, they certainly can't. This is one of my big soapbox topics. You cannot consciously follow a rule that you do not understand. So if you don't understand the rule, there's no way you can consciously follow the rule. Now, you could accidentally follow the rule, and that's, I guess, fine. But the point being, you want, especially in HR, you want people to understand the rules and then abide by the rules. And like, you're not going to do that if you don't understand the rules. So we're going to close off this segment with just that little mantra. You cannot consciously follow a rule that you do not understand. And these large language models are opening the door to that. We'll be right back. You're listening to DM Radio. All right, folks, back here on DM Radio, your host, Eric Kavanaugh, talking to Oz Wasserman, co-founder of Opsin Security, on our show, Fear Not, a security model for Gen AI. So, Oz, we were talking in the last segment about some use cases, one in particular, HR, but there's another very interesting use case that you can talk about for this food delivery company around financial data and really enabling a co-pilot for financial data. Can you talk about that, who uses it and what value they get from it?
Absolutely. So when we initially started, this was one of the first projects that we deployed our security orchestration layer with. And this food delivery company, what they wanted to do, which is pretty ambitious, is they wanted to have what they called a financial co-pilot. So back to the challenge a little bit. So if you think about in the world of finance and the world of the financial analysts, a lot of manual work comes into reporting. So they have financial reconciliation reports, FP&L statements, accounting statements, things, financial information they need to provide to the stock market because they're a publicly traded company. I mean, a lot of this work is a very manual and tedious work that they have to do and to go to like systems like NetSuite or any financial related documents and get the information and build the report in the Excel. The manual work takes several weeks actually for a lot of these reporting aspects. And they were thinking about how do we actually leverage generative AI to help us and assist us, which is like the co-pilot ability of point of view. So the financial analyst can save literally weeks of work, of manual work, and streamline a lot of these reporting processes. So that was like a high level goal of the project. And truly what happened was, and still happening, is that information from financial documents, from structured sources that include a lot of the financial information the organization has, as well as content or relational management systems such as NetSuite, are all streamed to a generative AI model. And that way, the financial analysts can actually, within a few steps with the generative AI model, can actually build these reportings, get a lot of the questions and things that they have on the financial reports, and then build it way faster. We're talking about from about 6.5 to 7 weeks per report to a matter of days. And then if you think about the full-time employee hours that you're saving on this project is pretty phenomenal. So the company is very excited. And we talked previously about the HR bot that actually came secondary after this project because they just developed the appetite of how amazing generative AI applications that are done right with the context on the data can be done here. So that's on the value and the return on investment perspective. It's all about operational efficiency and streamlining those manual processes exactly like this, and then achieving value.
So we talked about this on a show earlier today, in fact, and it's very, very important stuff. I talked about the end of BI as we've known it, business intelligence, and how Gen AI is really transforming decision support. And that's kind of what you're talking about now, running reports. That's part of decision support. It's part of reporting in general, understanding what happened in the business financially, which of course is very important stuff. And what I find so interesting is that the models in the way you put forth the prompt and the instructions that you give to the model can run through what previously would be many difficult, time-consuming, somewhat clumsy manual processes and just burn right through them. So instead of having to log in, pull this report, manually look up and down, like get some numbers from this, okay, plug this into my Excel spreadsheet. Like all this is manual work. It's very tedious. It's error prone because it's tedious. And now these models, again, if you have the security and the governance and these guardrails baked into your workflow, then these prompts can just bring back all sorts of disparate data, fuse it together in a meaningful way, and give you a syntactically correct answer for a very, very complex question. So, to your point, that's why you can do 6 weeks of work in 5 or 6 days. And again, improves the morale, gets the job done so that people know they're on the right track. I mean, there are all of these efficiency gains. Some of them are harder to gauge than others or to quantify. But nonetheless, I mean, especially if you have that citation capability I talked about, where it'll show you where it got the information from this rule, from that rule, that's just huge. I mean, it's such a change. It kind of reminds me, and you've been talked about this, how this wave we're seeing right now of innovation is very similar to the early internet days. I mean, in the early internet days, if you wanted to know what some quote was from some book, you had to go down to the library and use
Exactly.
the card catalog system, go get the book, take it out, try to find. I mean, oh my God, you'd be there all day. Now online, just do your Google search and you got it. Well, now this is the next phase where again you have to have the pieces and parts in place. That's what you guys are focused on, is enabling all that. But once you have that, you can get to these incredibly complex answers, I mean, 10 to 100 times faster. And that also fuels the operations of the business, right? It's like greasing the tracks. So you're not wasting time waiting on someone to go through this arduous process to give you some complicated answer about something. You just get right to the answer. I mean, are you seeing in this client and in other folks you're talking to, are people genuinely realizing like, wow, this is a huge deal? I can't like it's just massively game changing, right?
That's very true. In fact, I was very surprised when I saw these numbers initially when we deployed our layer with them and just looking into the quantification of value. It's just tremendous. I remember I talked to my co-founders like, oh my goodness, this is truly phenomenal, if you really think about it. And obviously it's not as simple as it sounds. You have to do a lot of the accuracy and the prompt engineering behind the scenes to make sure that it's grounded with the context you need. But once you achieve that, financial analysts there are actually starting to absolutely love it, absolutely adopt it as part of their work process and their new, because if you think about it, it's a new way to do work. Even myself, I use a
Yeah,
lot of these
right.
GPT tools to change the way I actually work. So a lot of, obviously, the adoption is about making sure that these financial analysts, for example, are doing what they need to do. And just maybe to add, obviously we are a security company. I'm blown away by how this value is being achieved at this food delivery company. But you talked a little bit about security and governance. And this project, the way we actually partnered with this company is because this project was blocked from the very beginning. And I'll tell you why. Obviously, financial documents or financial information in general is a very highly sensitive information that the company owns, especially a publicly traded company. And the moment you connect data in general to any new system, you increase the risk of unauthorized access. It doesn't matter if it's generative AI or any other stack in whether if it's data or any other tooling that you have as an enterprise
Yep.
organization.
Yep.
The moment you connect it to generative AI is you increase the risk of exposure, increase the risk of unauthorized access. And in this particular use case, um, there's specific financial analysts that are doing specific reporting tasks. And this organization is global, so they have multiple geographical locations that are doing different type of reporting. So how do you
Right.
ensure
Right.
that the right financial analyst from the right geolocation can only query and receive the information and creating the reporting on functions or responsibilities that he has to do, and not more than that? Because when you connect all this data, it becomes a very powerful tool to search the entire financials of the company, including things you don't want this specific financial analyst, even not the CFO, to see at times. So how do you
Yeah.
restrict that? That is the challenge.
Right. Well, and you're reminding me of something, and this has to do with the complexity of automation. And anyone who has ever engaged in an actual automation project, I guarantee has learned this lesson, because you always have to watch out for the exceptions. They're the ones that make life kind of difficult, is the exceptions in some automation workflow. And you just made a really interesting point that geolocation matters a lot, because if you're in this region, maybe you have let's the different states. Different states have different laws around things and different regulations. Healthcare is a perfect example, financial services, government. There are different sets of rules in different places. So, and this is one of the really cool things about some of these generative AI models, like Kindy, for example, because what they do that's interesting is you can load in, let's say, a policy document for the regulations in the state of Illinois. Then when that changes, if you have a dynamic link to, let's say, the register of that state, or if it's federal, it's the federal register. If you have a dynamic link and it senses that something changed, they will go and redo their frequently asked questions automatically. And then you go in and you update them yourself. So basically, you don't need to worry about some person manually hearing about this and going and reading all these rules and then thinking, all right, now how are we going to do all this? No, it's just baked into the workflow. Yes, you still want to check it and to verify it and to curate it, but to have all that stuff dynamically done for you, that's crazy. I mean, that's just it is so much more efficient, because the other thing they're very good at is, again, understanding syntax and protocol and policy, right? Like, I'm just really fascinated by this, and still it's just predicting the next letter and the next word, which kind of blows my mind. But if it has enough training, if it's been trained on enough data, it's very good at understanding these rules, understanding in quotes, I should say, and being able to reflect that. So that's just crazy town. And it's really important because regulations are changing all the time these days. And that turns your regulatory group into a proactive operation instead of a dreadfully reactive operation. What do you think?
I think that's very accurate. I think you're talking a lot about the concept of orchestration,
Hmm.
orchestration of data, dynamically syncing that data. It actually makes a lot of sense, right? Because the change is so vast and so fast,
Right.
and you need to make sure that, the number one challenge that generative AI has in general, I think, is hallucination and the way that is not as accurate. And I think it's a matter of us as practitioners and people who want to enable generative AI, not only from security and governance perspective, but also obviously to bring value, is to truly orchestrate and update all the data that we have with these systems. And it's just going to be like a catch-up game. So how do you actually do it in a meaningful way is always very, very important. And even in the world of security, by the way, the whole reason we call ourselves a security orchestration layer, it's a very similar concept actually. It's just from a permissioning and access perspective. So if you have a new financial analyst, for example, or specific financial information is all of a sudden should not be seen by Eric, should not be seen by Oz, or it went, doesn't go to the SEC for a certain amount
Right.
of time, and now it
Right.
does. So
Right.
it all constantly changing, right? So how do you ensure when you connect that into AI models that you have the same level of synchronization? Because otherwise, the alternative is to manually either updating these permissions, maintaining this policy yourself, and it just diverts you or moving you away from achieving the true value that generative AI needed to achieve for your business. So that's what we do. We help you orchestrate that from a security perspective, similarly to what you talked about from a data perspective.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And anyone who has ever managed permissions on a database, for example, like who gets access to MongoDB, who gets access to this Teradata analytic engine, they know that if you have to manually change the permissions every time someone comes on board, or when someone gets a promotion, or if someone gets fired or is under investigation, that is just tedious manual workflow, which is going to drive you completely bananas. So what you want to be able to do is automate that process by connecting it. You suggest doing this orchestration. You're connecting to LDAP, you're connecting to Active Directory, you're connecting to policy documents, for example. And then, of course, you've got all your data, but you're working in that layer of permissions and roles and responsibilities. And the more dynamic that can become, the more scalable your operation is, the faster things get done. And I would argue probably 9 times out of 10, the more accurately things get done. Not that you can't make mistakes in this world. You can certainly make mistakes and they may propagate and become significant, but nonetheless, to be able to streamline those processes gets you to the nuts so much faster and then allows you people to do the work they're supposed to do. Because all that stuff is admin, and admin is always just painful and tedious and just has to get done. So if you can automate that, you're going to be a happy person. Well, don't touch that dial, folks. We'll be right back. You're listening to DM Radio. All right, folks, welcome back once again to DM Radio, talking all about security and governance for large language models, allowing your organization to leverage AI responsibly that will be in compliance with regulations. It's a lot of fun stuff out there. Oz Wasserman of Opsin Security is with us. And Oz, I'm always a detail guy. I want to know, okay, if I'm using this technology, what are the levers I have to pull? What does it look like to me? How do I connect to LDAP? And then uh, I guess my real question is, how granular can you be on the permissions that you give people? How do you put exceptions into place? So you're going to have your garden variety scenarios, but there are always exceptions. How do you manage exceptions? Like someone who's hired by the board to come in and gets purview over everything, like a special counsel for data or something like that. Like, how do you actually do that inside the system?
Yeah, excellent question. So before I touch that, which is more on our policy engine, so the way that we're connecting to this generative AI stack, right? So again, connecting to our mission for a moment. Our mission is to actually securely orchestrate the connection of data to your generative AI model. But not only that, is that you really want to take any type of model that you want to use, whether if it's from Anthropic, whether if it's from OpenAI, whether if it's from other providers out there, and orchestrate that connection between data and the foundational model securely in generative AI. Because we do believe that once you do that, and once you take the best performing foundational model with your data, you will be able to achieve value faster and securely. So that is just from a high level perspective. Now, how do you actually do that? Nuts and bolts you talked about. So basically what we developed is what we call data connectors. So, anything from data you want to connect from documents, whether if it's Google Drive, OneDrive, SharePoint, Box, Dropbox, all the way down to a structured environment, which is the Snowflake, the databases of the world, all the way to, CRM systems like Salesforce and NetSuite. And if you think about these systems have different permission mechanisms and different access levels that you have to maintain in the generative AI application. So what we do is we are extracting a lot of the metadata from these sources, including the permissioning and the information. And then we're building a metadata layer in front of your vector databases or any type of vector search you're running in the generative AI application in such a way that the moment that Eric or any type of employee asks the prompt is the moment I go to what I call my policy engine, checking who's Eric based on the authentication with tools like Okta or Entra ID to really understand who that person is that asks this question. And then I'm checking on this metadata layer I extracted from the original source, whether Eric has the access to that specific information, whether it's from a document, whether it's from that database, or whether it's from Salesforce. And if it does, then I'm actually going to let the generative AI application to perform the vector search. But if it doesn't, then I will create an action in Opsin, whether to block, whether to monitor and sending an alert. It honestly depends on the organization. And for your question, how do you actually creating this nature of exceptions or things around like, specific policies? So our approach is more about, hey, we want to let you just unblock your organization. So we build this policy from you from the get-go. So we take the original permission, build it with your authentication layer, and that's it. It's there. However, we do know that the world is not perfect. You have the exceptions, like you mentioned. There's like people that are going to come and want to get more access that they should get. And that's the beauty of having a policy engine in that stack, in a way that if you remember in the beginning of the show, I did say that generative AI is this world of if you don't embed the permission, they're not going to be there. So we do embed the permission, but we can have an exception for a specific role to be able to access more than they need the access for. So we do allow you to also configure that part of our system.
Yeah, that's just fascinating. And here's my other question. Policy documents. I mean, you think legal documents, right? If you've ever read the documentation of a law, it's borderline bewildering because you'll get through this whole section of definitions. This means this in that context, that means that in that context. Normal humans can't read through that stuff and understand what the heck it means, but these machines can, right? So are you able to take a policy document, a 20-page document from a company, and load it into your system to create at least the wireframe around a policy that can then be enforced by your technology such that you can go in and tweak things and get it right? But my question is, can someone take their existing policy document for data access and just load that into Opsin security and at least be further along the way in getting that baked and finalized?
Yeah, so we do obviously do this plumbing for companies that we work with. In terms of the policy document itself, a lot of the organizations we work with actually implemented this policy document into their systems. Like
Oh,
the
wow.
documents are actually labeled, and the general access is restricted. Obviously, some organizations are not as mature, but it's definitely a service that we allow our customers to tackle. And specifically on these policies, they can be tedious. We are using summarization techniques on the large language model side to also build that out of the box policy for your organization. So we are allowing you, obviously, our mission is to really not have you deal with any type of setting up the permission and the security of it. In fact, our motto is leave the security and governance for us and just achieve your business value the fastest way possible. Uh,
Wow. That's pretty cool. And again, security and governance, these are the two big hurdles. Obviously, data cleanliness, you want to make sure your data is clean. You want to make sure your policy documents are up to date. All these things are also table stakes to get this stuff done. But I think that's a pretty powerful value proposition you have there. Look, we'll take care of it. You let us know what your policies are, how you want to do this. We will bake that into the system. That's pretty compelling, and it's also very useful, I'm sure, for regulators and for the people on the other side of the equation who will come in and see how this all works and say, "Oh, okay, so that's how you're tackling." That's what they want. They want to know that companies have policies in place, that those policies are enforced, that there's an audit trail so you can check and see what happened, and you're enabling all those things, right?
That's correct, and it's a very good comment because alongside, enforcing the access to data and ensuring you reduce the risk of unauthorized access, obviously, as simple as that, you just want to prove it. You want to prove it to yourself. You want to prove it to the auditors. And you want to prove it even to your management, right?
Right.
Because as you go with these generative AI applications, and as you achieve value and you increase adoption, the risk goes, higher. It's just a natural thing. The moment you open it to more people, the moment that people will try to manipulate the systems, I mean, it happens in a cyclical way. So we do give you the auditability and the ability to understand for each prompt what was asked, what data was served or not served, what was the original data source. So not even just the regulators that can just download the report and understand that you're compliant, but also for yourselves, right? To really understand that the data is being secured and the data is not being exfiltrated, because generative AI is not a deterministic system. I
Well,
mean,
that's right.
people will try to poke holes into it and try to manipulate it, I'm sure. And the ability to actually have the audit, understanding that these things are rolled properly and understanding that we can monitor it closely, not only just for the sake of reporting, but also seeing anomalous behavior in these things. So the short answer is this is one of the key things that we're giving organizations, but it just obviously goes beyond that.
Yeah, I mean, it's all very, very important, and it allows you to execute on the governance and security mission through a specific layer of functionality, and that's the technology that you're building. And I like the way you've really focused on getting into the runtime, because that's the key. You have to be in between A and B. You have to be in between all the corporate data, absorbing the policies, and the large language model to be careful about what goes into that stuff, because, of course, that's going to color what comes back out, whether or not the large language model is training itself and fine tuning itself on your data. And they talk about this. ChatGPT says, "Oh, we don't do that anymore." Some of these guys say, "We don't do it anymore." Well, we don't really know for sure. That I think that's one of the things to keep in mind. You don't really know whether or not they're doing it. But folks, podcast bonus segment is coming up next. You're listening to DM Radio. All right, folks, time for the podcast bonus segment here with Oz Wasserman of Opsin Security. We're talking about Fear Not, a security model for Gen AI. And Oz, we just talked on a show today with the data analytics group on LinkedIn that's run out of Germany. Very, very cool show we did just today. And we were talking about your different options. So I think most businesses are going to try to find some way to leverage this technology. It makes a lot of sense to do that. So if you're a big forward-looking organization, do you do your own model, which is possible? I interviewed Naveen Rao from Mosaic ML a year ago, and he said we try to demystify this whole topic of building your own model because it's not that hard. You can do it, but what are the trade-offs if you do it? Number one, it's expensive. Number two, it takes a lot of time and effort, and it's something you have to manage then over time. These models do tend to go sideways. They do break. Weird things can happen. So there's all that. But there's also the opportunity cost of not being able to leverage the innovations at these large language model companies like OpenAI, like Anthropic. Because if you go down your own path, it's going to be harder for you to leverage the innovations in these engines that these folks are building because you're outside of that circuit now. You've forked basically the innovation path down your own highway, which has some benefits for security, for protecting IP, all that kind of fun stuff. But a lot of people are going to want to use the third-party services, and they're the people you're really serving. And that's a big deal, right? Because when I think about what's going to happen here, I'm very sure about this. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. These individual like ChatGPT, OpenAI, they're going to be baking in additional layers of functionality, like maybe a relational data processing engine, for example. What's to stop OpenAI from coming up with a relational model that could be an up service or an upsell basically? And all of a sudden, maybe I don't need my data warehouse anymore if they can do that inside. Well, if you've gone down and forked your own pathway, you're not going to be able to do that. But if you are using this option security approach, then you can benefit from whatever innovations these guys do on their end, right, Oz?
That is correct. And maybe even before I answer, I'll give you an analogy from one of the projects we're doing for this storage company. There's a lot of skepticism, right? Like people just want to see the value. And this individual we're doing the project with, head of AI and innovation, is just we were saying, I need to show value to my management before I'm getting additional budget and additional attention. Right, let's just break it down for a moment what it truly means. Like, if you really want to show management that this experiment that you're running, but everybody's skeptical about it, as we know in an enterprise, there's a lot of skepticism, and you got to push forward. You got to understand that your little experiment needs to be successful in order for you to get more budget, more headcount, and then really truly leverage that properly.
Right.
And what it means is like you gotta be as accurate as possible, the fastest way possible.
Yeah.
So, what you need to do, I mean, from a basics perspective, like you need to use the best tools out there, best models with as much context from the organization to really get this experiment off the ground fast. So as simple as that, like you mentioned, you really need what you truly need to do is to orchestrate between the company data and the foundational model in a
Interesting.
secured way.
Right.
And what we are actually trying to do is exactly that. So if we go more in like the specifics, the orchestration of it can be, if you're using these third-party foundational models, sometimes at some query, like the depending on the prompts, it might contain sensitive regulated information that will go technically to those foundational models to generate the result as part of this whole RAG architecture. So what we help there, as we go back to the policy engine I just talked about a couple of minutes ago, our policy engine is able to also help you either block it or redact this information or tokenize this information when it goes into this third-party model. We're extensive and customizable to the point where again, the mission is to help you orchestrate it securely. So it's up to your organization what you want to do. You can block it, you can flip it and tokenize it and reconstruct it on the way back. But everything is being done so you can use the best tools and to the organizational needs and to achieve the value the fastest way possible.
Wow. That is just fantastic stuff. Well, folks, we burned through the better part of an hour here with Oz Wasserman, co-founder of Opsin Security. Look these folks up online, OPSIN Security. Oz, thanks so much for your time. Congratulations, and I'm sure we'll be hearing from you more in the future.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for having me.
All right, take care. Thanks so much.
Bye bye.
All right, folks, you've been listening to DM Radio.